It's actually not the report they did, it's a report that was adopted by Cabinet to produce a white paper. The original report was much different. But there we are, that's what white papers are. You might be pleased to know that since 1950, the Australian government and Australian government agencies alone have commissioned 67 reports on Australia and Asia. 67 in 63 years. We've been very good at producing reports. I've done one myself for the Australian government in 1988. We're pretty good at producing reports. We're awful at implementing them. And obviously, I fear the present report of Ken Henry and his team, Australian Asia Centre, is going to go the same way the others will go. It will be, not least because the new government sees this as the product of a bad Labor government. So there we are, number 68 will be on its way in the next 12 or 18 months if we've got anything to go by, along with the new Defence White Paper, because we might like the last one either. There's a long, long history of the rhetoric of Australia's future lies in Asia. If you go to your local library and just tap into the catalogue, Australia's Asia Future, you'll find hundreds of books written over the last 30 or 40 years. Now, there was if you looked at the Australian Asia Century White Paper, it had a commendable broad coverage. Yes, it was anodyne in the end, but it did set up 25 national objectives at the meta level. So the government didn't actually commit to doing anything, they just set up this vision up there. It's an aspirational document. It wasn't a policy document, it was an aspirational document. It's saying what we would like to be in the year 2025. And the objectives are at that meta level. But I think if you're serious about the report, there's a strong smell of complacency to it. Why? Well, it could be 4 reasons, and you may have many others. It's got a very static view of Asia. Its view is that Australia might change and somehow or other Asia is not. The reality is that Asian countries are changing, modernising, innovating extremely quickly. They're not standing still. And this will pose real challenges for this country if we just think we're dealing with a static Asia that's just waiting for us to engage with it. And the complacency about the deep changes taking place within Asia leads to a policy position, I think, that all these changes taking place will be very good for Australia. It's kind of the Australian feeling, isn't it? We're going to have all these changes around us. The world is going to change. We're going to engage with Asia, but there's going to be no pain for Australia in doing it. We won't have to change terribly much. There's an assumption too running right through all the debate about Australia and Asia in the last 50, 60 years. The assumption that somehow or other we have an advantage over the rest of the world because, quote unquote, we lie at the foot of Asia. We've got geographic advantages. I quote you the Australian Asia Century White Paper 18 months ago, 12 months ago. It said, the tyranny of distance is being replaced by the prospects of proximity. Now, if that isn't rhetoric, I don't know what is. I'm not sure that we have a proximity or a prospect of proximity being any real advantage to Australia anymore. And very quickly, that brilliant Australian historian from the conservative end of politics, Geoffrey Blainey, a fabulous historian, Geoffrey Blainey wrote a very perceptive critique in The Australian saying, get with it. It doesn't take, if you hop on a plane, it doesn't take much longer to go from London to Beijing than it goes from Sydney to Beijing. And given modern technology and the internet, the notion of somehow or other our geographic position at the foot of Asia means that we have an advantage is nonsense. There's also, through the White Paper, an implicit belief in the capacity of Australian companies to succeed in Asia. Now, at the Asian Studies Association of Australia, which I have the honour to be president, this conference in Sydney last year, John Menadue, the former head of the Prime Minister's Department and the Menzies and former ambassador and head of Qantas at one stage, he was less than optimistic about the record of Australian management in the last couple of years, or the last couple of decades. He spoke with this beautiful phrase, Australian companies have gone smoko on Asia in the last 2 or 3 decades. Yep. I don't think that's true, having spent quite some time talking to, over the years, talking to boardrooms and things, and I was at a company about a decade ago, and it hasn't changed, I'm not forward now. I'm talking about Asia. I looked around, it's a financial company of some size. I came away thinking, I'm glad they're not managing my superannuation. But I looked around the board and asked any of them how many of them actually been to an Asian country and spent time there. Nobody had. They'd all been through Singapore or Hong Kong, but they hadn't actually spent any time in an Asian country. And it just seemed to be a slight problem. Apart from the fact not being any women on the board, but don't worry about that one. Australia clearly, if you're honest about it, has two very short-term advantages in relation to Asian countries. It's got minerals aplenty in the ground, and it's a potential food bowl. But I'm not sure that being a quarry with a view and a food bowl, where most of the extractive industries and the food production is in the hands of rather large foreign companies, I'm not sure that in the next decade or two that's going to be enough for us to prosper. As a historian, I can't help reflecting that one of the definitions of colonial power and colonialism was that the economies were extractive economies, food-producing economies, in the hands of global multinationals. Are we in danger of having a colonial economy? No, and also no quarrying or food production is necessarily going to produce a large number of jobs. We lack an industrial base, we lack a policy on industry. For goodness sake, we even lack a science minister, and this really is appalling. We lack all of this. We lack our own science, our own technology, our own innovation. I'm sorry, it does matter. And I think we lack the management skills to take Australia into the Asia century. And even the Henry report, the white paper, acknowledged that there is a problem there. We need to have a much more hard-headed and a much more strategic assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of the Australian economy and Australian society and the structures that underpin it. And a much more strategic vision of what we're going to excel at in the next decade or two, and how we're going to integrate education, innovation, science, technology, and industrial policies. We do not have a vision, we do not have an integrated strategic policy in this country on those areas. We have lots of waffle, we have lots of papers, but we do not have an integrated policy. Look for example, at the education goals in the Australian Asia Century White Paper. The goals are ambitious. Who could disagree with them? We're going to have 10 Australian universities in the top 100 universities in the world by 2025. We're going to have we're going to be in the top 5 schooling systems in the world in 2025. Fantastic, good idea. Who can disagree with that? But that's not going to happen because we say it's going to happen. Somebody needs to realise that there are quite a few countries in Asia who also think they're going to have 10 universities in the top 100 universities in the world by 2025, and that they're pouring money into those institutions to make sure they damn well get there. What we've been doing for the last 20 years is defunding university education. We now fund university education per head around 25% less than we did 25 years ago in real terms. We're making rhetorical statements in the assumption that Asian countries aren't changing and aren't developing their systems as well. It seems to me to be part of this complacency. We are not going to have 10 universities in the top 100 universities in the world by 2025 unless we change our policy dramatically. I've taken a number of Australian Vice-Chancellors times through various Asian countries to try and educate them and educate company leaders as well. I point out that if you take the 6 institutes of technology in India, they are as good as, if not better than, every engineering school in this country. I've taken deans of engineering through the Institute of Technology in Singapore, and they go, wow, they've got all that equipment. And these are just institutes of technology, these aren't the universities. Chinese universities, Indian universities, Korea, Japan, Singapore, pouring money into the science, technology end of university education. When we seek to set up joint projects It's us that are mendicants, because we don't have the money we just have to say, please let us in. We have a few bright people, but we don't have the money to join the projects. Do we really believe that Australia is going to be in the top 5 schooling systems in the world by 2025? Schooling systems. And if we do, are we prepared to do what we need to do to get there? Now, I think the reforms proposed by the Gonski Committee were a terrific start. I wouldn't put your money on them being implemented fully, because we don't really believe in education as an investment. We spend less on public education now than most OECD countries do. And it's a disgrace, given, and as a boy that came up through a state education system, from working class families at first, and only one in my immediate family to go to university, I'm a grateful recipient of an education system in Western Australia which was extremely good for kids like me. But are we going to create a system in the future which will enable people to realise their potential across the board, not just if you're the children of the middle class like mine are? And what are the consequences of failure on the education front? The US, the UK, Europe, many of the countries of Western Europe, they've got much stronger indigenously owned technologies than we do. Let alone what's happening in China, what is happening in India, in Japan, South Korea, and will happen in Singapore and elsewhere. Being in close proximity to Asia will not guarantee our economic future at the level we've got it now. And I think that we've got to burst through that complacency to actually put some strategic policies into place, knowing that it's going to cost us. Knowing that reducing taxes and helping the upper middle class do extremely well in the short term is not the answer to Australia's relationship with Asia. Let me turn to the second one briefly on Indonesia. And I thought about this before the events of the last weekend, but just to kind of make it more pertinent. If you look at how we talked about Indonesia for the last 50 or 60 years, we always talked about Indonesia being our nearest neighbour. And it's undeniable that Indonesia is, after Papua New Guinea, we're our nearest neighbour, located next to each other. In that sense, we're physical neighbours. But we all know from personal experience, relations with neighbours can be good, they can be bad, quite frequently they can be quite indifferent. Neighbours have a tendency to squabble. Indeed, the Australian courts are full of disputes between neighbours. Neighbourly relationships are for the most part functional, correct, and they're best at moments of crisis. Our strongest relationships as individuals and families are generally not with our immediate neighbours, but people who live a little bit of distance away. Space between people seems to make the relationship a bit easier. And relations between states have the similar characteristics. Close proximity does not necessarily lead to good relationships. Look at the relationships between states that are close to each other in Europe over the last 100, 150 years. Or the relationship between China and Japan, or China and Vietnam, or India and Pakistan. Keep going. They're all fraught. People in neighbouring countries tend to develop what I call imagined histories of each other, based on perceived wrongs and unbarely understood myths and folklore. And people in neighbouring countries also tend to be more aware of the differences between themselves and their neighbour, whether it's linguistic differences, ethnic differences, cultural, religious, and you tend to stereotype each other. Just think of the French and the Germans, or the Germans and the French, or the British and the French, and keep going. Reality can quite easily give way to prejudice, and if you look at the history of Australia's relationship with Indonesia over the last 50 odd years, since Indonesian independence, 60 odd years, it's been one of very sharp swings in emotions in Australia and in popular perceptions of Indonesia. If you look at the question that's constantly asked, there's been one consistent question asked in opinion polls for 60 odd years: who do you see as the greatest threat to Australia? For the last decade and a half has been Indonesia. And one of the problems being is that we're full of rhetoric and we're full of cliches about our relationship with Indonesia, uttered by politicians and commentators alike who have the foggiest idea about the country. We have to be realistic about what it's possible to achieve in the relationship. and that way that our false hopes won't be dashed again. It's not going to be a relationship that's easy to manage. I well remember a prominent Indonesian intellectual saying to me many years ago, when I was with a bunch of Indonesians and we were around talking about a major issue, and they were getting a bit prickly. And I said, why are you getting prickly? And he said, John, he said, you have to remember, you colonised us. We didn't colonise you. And the sense of colonial arrogance is so strong in Indonesia. You could see it again over the last few days, the response to Australian government on boat people, where for 12 months leading up to election, people arrogantly got on television and said, oh, we don't care what Indonesia thinks, we're pushing the bloody boats back, whether they like it or not. Well, I'm sorry, it ain't going to happen like that. And if you want to get anything done, you don't put your hands on your hips and you don't treat the country as if it's a colonial power again. We do not understand the history of Indonesia, generally. We don't understand the difficulty of running a country with 13,000 islands, 250 million people, with 130 odd different ethnic groups. We don't understand the difficulty of running a complex society like that. We don't understand the trials and tribulations that Indonesia's undergone in the last 60 odd years since independence. We don't understand the struggles in Indonesia to create a democracy, which in the last 16 years they've managed to struggle through quite well. Generally, we've got a very simplistic view of Islam, based upon a view of fairly hardline jihadism coming out of the Middle East. We don't understand the diversity of Islam in the world. We don't understand that Islam is as diverse as Christianity is diverse, and that the Ian Paisley of Northern Ireland does not represent mainstream Christianity, and neither does that character Jones of Jonesville in the United States years ago. We don't understand that the difficulties of building a nation. We don't understand the difficulties that the Indonesian elite have in themselves trying to develop a moderate version of Islam that is part of the modernising process of Indonesia. One of the good things that governments have done, it was done by a previous Liberal government, it was done by the Labor government as well, one of the really very good things they did with Australian aid to Indonesia was to pour money into schools run by the moderate Islamic organisation Muhammadiyah. I hope that survives the cuts in Ausaid. It's been a brilliant program for our long-term benefit, for their benefit, but for our benefit. Some years ago, a comment was made that the Australian-Indonesian relationship lacked ballast. And I think that's still a fair comment. And it's important that we build on the relationships at the people-to-people level. I despair sometimes about our politicians. But we must put some ballast in relationship. We must also realise that Indonesia, being a democracy, and it's had now 16 years of, it's changed governments peacefully, it's had elections